Good morning again and welcome to those that were not here before. Now we will go to the next Analytical Corner, which is why are workers in Europe working fewer hours? I am Rodolfo Dall'Orto from the Secretaries Department in the IMF. And before I introduce our two presenters, let me ask you to please silence your phones if you haven't done it yet. And at the end of the presentation, we will have about 15 minutes for questions. So with that, let me introduce Ipei Shibata and Niels Jakob Hansen, who will present to us today.
Good morning, everyone. You may have forgotten, but around 4 years ago today, the COVID-19 pandemic shocked the world. In Europe, as well elsewhere around the world, workers were sent home as countries implemented lockdown measures. A lot of companies went bankrupt, and many workers even lost their jobs. There was so much uncertainty, and some even speculated that the world would never return to what it was. Fast forwarding to today, the world looks very different from what we imagined in March 2020. The European labor markets have bounced back strongly. Employment rates have surged past their pre-pandemic levels, and there are now reports about labor shortages. However, average number of hours per worker in Europe remains stuck in its pre-pandemic level. This observation has generated widespread debate among economists and policymakers. With the labor market remaining hot and firms scrambling to find workers, why are average working hours not recovering?
Yes, why are Europeans working fewer hours than before the pandemic? Is the reduction in hours here to stay? And can and should policies do anything about it? I'm Niels Jakob Hansen, an economist here with the IMF.
And I'm Ipei Shibata, also an economist at the IMF. In this presentation, we are going to take a closer look at the European labor market and discuss what we can expect going forward.
So let's start by taking a closer look at what happened on the labor market in Europe during the pandemic. In the left chart you see here, you see the development in employment rates across European countries before, during, and after the pandemic in 2020. Employment rates fell strongly at the onset of the pandemic, but then gradually started to recover. And by early 2021, employment rates had climbed above their pre-pandemic levels. In contrast, the right chart here shows how average working hours, even by 2023, had not recovered to their pre-pandemic levels.
This may look like another pandemic effect, but let's step back and take a historical perspective on the European labor market. This chart shows the trends of average working hours in France, Italy, United Kingdom, Germany, and Spain over the last 50 years. As you can see, average working hours have been falling for over 50 years, with some flattering in recent years. And in fact, the decline in average working hours during the pandemic is part of a long-run trend.
So what caused this long-run decline in average working hours? Was it caused by a change in the composition of employment towards occupation or worker groups where there is more part-time work, like retail or young workers? Or was it perhaps caused by a broad-based decline in hours worked across all worker groups? So we looked into this question closely, and here's what we found. The decline in average hours worked was in fact caused by a broad-based decline across worker groups. In the chart you see here, we decomposed the change in average hours worked from 2003 to 2019 into contribution from change in composition towards groups typically with fewer working hours, which is shown here in blue, and changes in hours worked within worker groups, which is shown here in orange. The orange part, or the within group components, account for more than 2/3 of the decline in average hours worked.
Although the decline in average working hours was broad-based, we still wanted to know whether certain groups saw a sharper decline in average hours worked than other groups. Digging further into the data, we found that average hours fell for all groups, but relatively more for young men and men with young children. This reflects the fact that more young people are enrolled in school today than before, and men with young children take more parental leave today than before. But what has caused workers to put in fewer hours? Well, we find that preferences played an important role. In fact, people want to work fewer hours today than 2 decades ago. As shown in the green line in the chart, the desired number of hours has fallen. This decline in desired hours mirrored the decline in working hours over this period, shown in orange. Moreover, for most groups, the gap between the desired hours and the working hours is pretty small. This indicates that most workers' working hours are aligned with their desired hours, suggesting that there is little scope for raising working hours.
So can and should policies do anything about the fewer working hours? With widespread labor shortages in Europe and continuous concern about wage inflation, it's natural to ask if policies can do anything to boost average hours. However, here we find that there are no low-hanging fruit for policymakers. In fact, there's no obvious case for trying to reverse a trend that is primarily driven by changes in workers' preferences. However, we find 2 notable exceptions: involuntary part-time workers and women with young children who on average would like to work longer hours than they currently do.
So some policies could help these groups of workers increase their working hours toward their desired levels. For example, reducing tax disincentives to work longer hours, enhancing training programs, and expanded childcare could all help them put more time into their job. However, even if such policies could reduce the gap between actual working hours and desired hours, such an increase would be small. They would only increase the working hours across Europe at around 1%. Put differently, it would only reverse 1/5 of the total decline observed in the last 2 decades.
So let's now turn to our final question. What will happen to average working hours going forward? So to answer this question, we revisited a well-known fact in the literature. Average hours worked tend to fall when countries get richer. So look at the chart here. Average hours worked tend to be lower in countries with higher GDP per capita levels. So what does this observation mean going forward? As GDP per capita in Europe is projected to continue growing over the medium term, this means that average working hours are likely to continue falling.
So, to sum up, we want you to leave this room with 3 facts. First, the decline in average working hours observed in Europe after the pandemic is part of a long-run trend and reflects worker preferences and growing income. Second, the scope for policies to increase working hours is modest. And third, the average working hours are likely to continue falling in the future. Thus, to end where we started, the lack of post-pandemic recovery in average working hours may not be a sign that the labor market is still suffering from the pandemic, but simply be a sign that Europeans work to live rather than live to work. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Ipei. Thank you, Nils Jakob. I think this was very interesting. I cannot stop thinking about the implications for the European countries. Let me open the floor for questions. We have running mics. You just need to raise your hand and say, please, your name, your affiliation, and try to keep it short so that we can take more questions after you. I see someone at the very back. There is.
Hello, my name is Lyric Hughes-Hale. I'm with EconView in Chicago. My question is, how do your findings relate to wages and income? In other words, how many of these workers are on salary? How many are paid hourly? Have you dissected that? And then you would assume this would have a positive effect on productivity. Can you speak to those 2 questions, please? Thank you.
Do you want to?
Okay. So first of all, our study mainly focused on the average hours worked. So we didn't dig into the wage part. So we cannot speak to the wage component. But you also mentioned about like productivity. So I think there's a big discussion on what's the optimal number of hours people should be working for the most maximum efficiency. But there's a big debate about this such optimal level. On one hand, there's a fixed cost of getting up to the speed, so you have to put in certain number of hours before you get most productive. At the same time, there's also fatigue effect, which is as you continue to work in long hours, you may get tired and maybe less efficient. So there's a debate about this optimal number of hours worked. But what we have seen in the paper is that this average hours work have been declining, not just last 20 years, but 50 years. And then this also partly reflects the worker preferences, as we showed. But we didn't speak too much about productivity, but there is also a lot of technological progress underneath this decline, such as compared to 50 years ago, we have computers to help enhance our productivity at work. So these are the things that we can mention from our paper. Thank you so much for your question.
Adding one thing to the productivity discussion, it's a complex relationship, and I think it can go both ways, right? I think what we are emphasizing in this paper is that higher productivity, meaning higher income levels, means that there's more welfare, and then that gives you substitution and income effects. And at least in Europe, it seems like those income effects dominate. So people exchange the higher productivity and the higher wages into more consumption, but also more leisure time. And that's kind of what is reflective of that long run growth that we showed, but also other papers have documented well.
Thank you. We have a question here on the second row.
Thank you. My name is Bill Papadakis with Lombard Odier in Geneva. My first question has to do with how distinct is this phenomenon in Europe? Do you see parallels anywhere, or is it really unique? And the second one was whether you see any evidence of labor hoarding post-pandemic that might help explain some of that phenomenon, in that companies hired, but even if there's not enough work to go around, they might keep employ same amount of people but reduce the hours. I'd be interested to hear that.
Maybe let me start answering that. So on your question about other countries, I think, so the focus of this paper was Europe, although in the paper we also show the development in average hours worked for the US. And there the decline is less pronounced than Europe. So that's kind of a well-documented fact that the hours tend to be falling stronger in Europe than they do in the US, at least after the Second World War. On your second question about labor hoarding, so I think that could be like a cyclical factor that could also play into what we're seeing after the pandemic. And I think that's certainly possible. And there are papers, I believe, from the European Commission that have been looking at that. So we're not ruling out that that can also be a factor. I think the point we're trying to make in this paper is that putting cyclical issues aside, there is also a longer-term trend that is important for understanding what is happening to hours worked, and that is manifesting when you compare hours before and after the pandemic.
Have more questions. Here, the gentleman.
My name is Anyway Sikochi, Harvard Business School. Very interesting. I think as you're talking about the desired level of hours and also the amount of hours worked. But I guess what I'm curious about is if you're looking at the amount of hours worked, do those sort of, I guess, align with the number of hours required for the economy to function? Or is there another line there that you could put that to sort of say there is some number of hours there that perhaps are being outsourced? In other words, how is the economy actually functioning? Is that what we're seeing, what we need, or is there more that's happening outside?
Yes, so I can try to answer. So first of all, that's a $1 million question that I think economists are interested in answering. Well, what's the best number of hours and total labor input to achieve the maximum output? But our paper cannot answer that questions. But however, what we have seen is that in the Europe, the total hours worked, so the labor input, has been already recovered pre-pandemic, while the average number of hours, the intensive margin of employment, has declining, in this period. So there's a component due to intensive margin and extensive margin, but in terms of the total labor input, the combination of the two has already seen the recovery in Europe, and they continue to do so. Yeah, for now.
Maybe adding one thing to that. So required hours, I guess it's a complicated object to think about. What we have been thinking about here, or an interesting thing about this paper, I think, is that we are able to look at these desired hours work. So, not required, but what do people actually want to work? And that's that. And those development at least seems to be in line with what is happening to to the actual hours work that is observed in the economy. So that's not required, but it's preferred hours. The other question, I guess, depends on, what is the objective function that you're solving. But at least at the individual level, it seems to be consistent with people working fewer hours as they want to.
Exactly on the point, that's why in our paper for the policy recommendation parts, we focus on specific groups that, basically want to work more. So involuntary part-time workers and women with young children who wish to work longer hours, but they are not actually working that desired hours level. So those are the areas we think the room for policies to intervene.
Here on the second row.
Good morning still, Luboš Komárek from the Czech National Bank. Do you please evaluate this effect of home offices? Because, this is something new, what we see after COVID. And second question, I would like to know more about this comparison between the, let's say, development in Europe and in the US, because the GDP growth in Europe is usually lower than in the US. And, if we work less, probably this is the result. And the third question is about efficiency and, the amount of work hours. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Let me start by answering that question. So the working from home question is a very good one, and I think it feeds into the discussion about how do we measure hours worked. So the measurement that we are using in this paper is from the labor force survey, where people report how many hours that they're working. Then that could lead to over or under reporting, depending on what you think is more likely. And of course, working from home may introduce some measurement error in how we capture it. However, I think that's consistently a issue with relying on this kind of data. So whether or not working from home is going to introduce more or less bias, I think is an open question. So the paper is not really able to say anything about that. It's only looking at these longer run trends, and there at least it seems to be that what is happening in the last couple of years is consistent with a longer run trend, and it doesn't seem necessarily that there's a strong break due to the pandemic. So, sorry, do you want to?
Yeah, and then maybe just add to that. Basically, for our data, when we use the micro level data to look into different demographic and industry and occupations, our data ends in 2019 due to some lag in the data set. So we cannot assess much of the recent development post-COVID. So that's one caveat of our paper. But at the same time, one of the forthcoming IMF working paper that should be coming out in a few weeks, we also try to look into this teleworkability and then the hours worked, how people use the gain in commuting time into whether leisure or more work. And then for the U.S., we found that some of them, the gain from the commuting, less commuting time, is spent on the working hours, but at the same time spend more on leisure, like spending time with their family and so forth. So, but our paper is strictly focusing on Europe and also pre-COVID level. So we cannot answer that question, but that's definitely something that is more interesting. It's interesting to look at, especially going forward for the research.
Coming back to your question about differences across various countries and how hours worked matters for GDP, I think obviously more hours lead to higher production, but I guess there's underlying all that there's a little bit of a discussion about how countries choose to distribute higher productivity, right? If it goes into more consumption, then hours should not be falling, but if that welfare gain goes into more leisure, then hours may be falling, right? So GDP is one measure, but broader welfare is another measure, and there, of course, leisure factor into the picture as well.
I think we have a question from the guest standing up. Not anymore? Okay, so then from the gentleman. Thank you.
My name is Lazarus Lambir, Duquesne University in Pittsburgh. I'm curious to know whether your data includes self-employed people, or is just strictly employees of other organizations? and also whether there's a pushback from employers regarding this unfolding phenomenon or not. Thank you.
So yeah, if I remember correctly, our data includes both self-employed and also employees of the. And then to answer your second question, I don't think we have a survey question trying to address whether firms want them to work longer hours or not. So, but that's I think something that is interesting to explore for the future research.
I mean, maybe one thing you could add to that is one measure, of course, you would look at to get at that would be labor shortages. Are companies reporting that they're trying to get workers and not being successful, right? I mean, you can fill those labor shortages by making your workers work more hours, or you can get in more workers. But the fact that we have seen labor shortages over the last couple of years, suggest at least that companies are willing to employ more than that they're currently doing. And then, of course, that feeds into the discussion about what is happening to wages as well.
We have a question there from the gentleman with the glasses. Yes.
Thank you very much. Thomas Eneroth from the Swedish Parliament. In Europe, there's a large difference when it comes to women's participation on the labor market. I mean, from Sweden, we have a very high participation from women, and in other southern part of Europe, so quite low. And it depends on the structure of the welfare sector, of course. Can you see any differences when it comes to women's participation and the number of working hours in your study?
You want to take?
Yes, I think I don't recall exactly which country has seen the decline and so forth by country, and especially for women specifically. I can talk about this decline in average hours worked at the country level. Like in our sample, the vast majority of the country have seen a decline in average hours worked. So in this presentation we focus on the averages, but there is, as you mentioned, there's a large country heterogeneity that we explore more in the actual paper. And then, but we still, if I remember correctly, out of 30 countries in the sample, like 27 countries have seen a decline in average hours worked between 2003 and 2019. But maybe we can touch base by offline and then try to dig into the.
Maybe one additional thing we can say there is we looked at, like Ipe was saying earlier in the presentation, we were looking at in which groups are these decline in hours worked more pronounced. And there we saw that individuals with kids have seen a larger decline. And of course that was over a period in time where there was an expansion of access to family leave. So obviously those kind of policies can affect hours worked. And then of course, then that leads into the second question about how widely are those available, and what are the economic benefits for the male or the female of using those kind of policies. So that's of course tied to the discussion as well.
So unfortunately, we need to wrap up. We're running out of time, but I would like to ask you what are the 2 or 3 key points that we should remember when we leave this room?
So, well, I would say you should leave the room with 3 facts, or 3 findings from this paper. One is that this decline in average hours worked that we have seen after the pandemic is in fact part of a longer run trend, and that it reflects preferences. Second point is that we think that the scope for policies to increase hours is probably modest in Europe. And third, we would expect this trend to continue in the future as GDP per capita is increasing. So thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you.